Vice President Biden, that as you leave office, you leave so with a sense of personal contribution and satisfaction that only a full life of family love and public service can provide. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome the Vice President of the United States.
Don't jump. Thank you. Please, thank you very, very, very much. Please be seated. Mr. Chairman, what a high honor and a wonderful compliment for you to introduce me and say the things you said. I hope as I leave this office, I hope my ability to stay engaged in the great affairs of the country is as partially as meaningful as yours has been. You have never, ever stopped serving your country, and you have never been stopped anyone from going to you and continue to ask for your advice and your input. You're one of the most respected economists in the country, and you're one of the most respected men in the country. So thank you for that wonderful introduction. It's good to be back up on the Hill. It's good to be back in Gadsden Hall. My son Hunter, as a matter of fact, 5 Bidens have graduated from this great university. One of my 3 children. Based on tuition, I think at least a sidewalk should be named after me or something. But one of my 2 sons, Hunter Biden, who's a brilliant young man, and 2 of my sister's children and 2 of my brother's children. And they all have, it's served them all incredibly well. I was thinking, President DeGioia, that as I walked out, the first time I walked on this stage was back when Father O'Donovan was president. And he asked me to deliver the most difficult speech I've ever delivered in my life. No speech, I mean this sincerely, that I work harder on. My son joined the Jesuit Volunteer Corps, and there was a retreat filled as this hall is today. And I was asked by Father whether I would come and speak on how my faith had informed my public policy. And I had spent most of my career, all of my career, making sure never to let the twain meet, to never talk about my faith as it related to public policy. It was personal. But I didn't know how to tell Father O'Donovan no. And I worked very, very, very hard. I mean this sincerely. I spent hours and hours trying to figure out how could I do this. And as we Catholics say, as the nuns used to say to us, as I examined my conscience, I realized that the one thing that informed my public policy the most was my faith and all the great faiths, abhorrence for the abuse of power. And so the subject matter, it ended up being a significant moment for me in realizing all the things that have ever gained my emotional commitment and my intellectual effort, all related to the abuse of power. From the time I got involved as a high school kid in the civil rights movement, to the women's movement, to the abuse of women and children, et cetera, as well as the abuse of economic power. And in a strange sense, this is a little bit what I want to talk about today. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you and the Volcker Alliance for organizing today's conference on maintaining the financial stability of our economy. It seems like a no-brainer, obviously, the financial stability of our economy. The chairman released a paper today that is a blueprint on how to make our financial system safer, especially mitigating the risk of short-term debt. And I think it's very, very important reading for financial regulators, business leaders, reporters, academics, and students, for anyone concerned about the future of our economy. And from my perspective, it comes, I think, at a very pivotal moment. You know, we're in the midst of one of the longest economic recoveries in American history, as the chairman pointed out a moment ago. On almost every measure, Americans are better off today than they were 8 years ago, but there's still a lot of people being left behind. But it wasn't an accident. It happened because we made some very tough, very unpopular decisions that things turned out to be the right call on balance. And one of the first people the president went to upon winning was Chairman Volcker, to lead a group of economists to give us the best advice we could, because you know, it's a recovery that requires us to remember just how far we've come and how we can't afford to go back to the policies that nearly brought down the entire economy just 8 years ago. You know, and that's what I'd like to talk with you a few minutes about today. 8 years ago this month, President-elect Obama and I were forming an administration, and the financial system was crumbling, and the economy was on the brink of collapse, and we lived the pain. And we can't ever forget the turmoil. People were terrified of another Great Depression. Over 3 million foreclosures a year from 2009 to 2011. Bank runs, thought to be a thing of the past, were back. Remember that in 1930, fearful depositors, our grandparents, great-grandparents, withdrew their money from banks. But in this Great Recession, and I remember, and Paul may remember, I got criticized for engaging in hyperbole when I named it the Great Recession. There goes Biden again, another Biden gaffe. I wish it had been a gaffe. But it wasn't our grandparents, it was in fact large institutions, not ordinary households, were taking their funds back. Credit markets dried up, making it almost impossible for small businesses to keep their doors open and meet a payroll. Prospective homeowners to get a mortgage, car buyers to get a loan, and right before Election Day, Lehman Brothers collapsed, unleashing a real, actual fear that the whole financial system could come crashing down. It's hard to remember that right now, thank goodness. Across the country, people were rapidly losing confidence in the government's ability to stem panic and to stabilize the financial system. And we have to remember that the turmoil in the financial sector led to crippling conditions in the real economy, the real lives of millions of American households and businesses outside of Wall Street, off of Wall Street. This month, 8 years ago, we had already lost 695,000 jobs. Good-paying, middle-class jobs. And when Barack and I placed our hands on the Bible, as we were sworn in on January 20th, 2009, we'd already lost almost 700,000 at that moment and ended up losing more than 800,000 that month of January. Unemployment would peak at 10%. Long-term unemployment saw historic highs. Poverty rate exceeded 15%, the highest level in decades. And the stock market plummeted. It's hard to believe it now, but remember, we were worried, what was it going to fall below 6,000? That was a debate. Trillions of dollars in wealth lost. Decades of retirement savings destroyed overnight. I think we're still feeling the lingering effects of that in terms of how people conduct themselves. Falling real estate prices left nearly a third of the mortgaged homes underwater. 7 million homes lost to foreclosure since the start of the Great Recession. GM and Chrysler, iconic automobile industry of the United States, headed toward bankruptcy, risking livelihoods of 1.5 million workers up and down the auto supply chain. And this economic crisis didn't happen by chance. The reason to remember how it happened is not to hold people responsible particularly, is to make sure we don't commit the same problem, the same sin again. You know, it was a direct result of short-sighted, irresponsible, and I would argue, greedy actions by Wall Street and Washington's lacks of regulation over a 20 to 30-year period. And so Barack and I knew that fixing the real economy meant stabilizing and fixing the financial system. Mr. Chairman, I remember a conversation that one we had, but I also remember the meetings we had to figure out what to do and how we leaned on you. I remember the first meeting the President-elect and I had with our economic team in Chicago a month before the inauguration. We were told that tens of millions of Americans owed more in their homes than they were worth, and we were told that we might need well over $1 trillion to fix the banks. The good news we were told, and I remember sitting in that room with about 40 economists. You weren't there. You were back in New York, I believe. I'm not sure where you were, but the economic team we had put together, advisory team, we were told to start it off, and the good news in the opening comment was, Mr. President, we have good news. We're not going to recommend that you call a bank holiday. It's like, whoa, what do you mean? That's the good news. But I'm serious. Not a joke. And it was said in deadly earnest because there were considerations of whether or not they were going to recommend that we call a bank holiday. I'll never forget. That's what President Roosevelt was told during the Great Depression. We knew our regulatory system was outdated, designed decades ago, and was ill-equipped to monitor the modern-day economy. And we had seen this play out before in major economic crises driven by insufficient regulation. I was there in the United States Senate when we dealt with the savings and loan crisis in the 80s. I was there when we had to deal with the failure of long-term capital management in the 90s. And I was there in the aftermath of the Enron debacle in 2000. Which reminds me of that old bad joke of Claude and Maud. They're in their late 90s sitting on the porch in their farm, and Claude looks at Maud and said, Maud, remember in WW1 I was gassed and I came home and you took care of me? And then Maud, she said, yeah. And she said, remember then in 1922 we went out and we bought that little drugstore, and then in 29 we lost it all, collapsed, and you were there, Maud. And then he goes through all these things in his life, and then I got drafted in WW2, and I that's when I lost these two fingers on my hand, Maud. And he goes through it all, and he looks at her and he said, Maud, I was thinking, you're bad luck. Well, maybe I'm bad luck because I went through all of those, but when it comes, because I was there. And when it comes to the Great Recession of 2008, we knew the specific underpinnings were complex, and but also that we could avoid repeating it again. Banks and other financial companies that originated mortgages knew that they could turn around and sell these loans in a heartbeat. So they often threw lending standards out the window, making billions of dollars on loans that were completely unprepared to people who were completely unprepared to make the payments. I remember a fellow who was a classmate of my son's, became a very successful real estate man, and I remember him telling me, you know, I had a housekeeper came up to me and said, guess what? They're going to give me a $300,000 loan to buy a $300,000 home. He said, how can you pay it? She said, well, they told me I'd be able to. I'm not making that up. Ratings agencies were paid by banks and institutions to a great risk. Time and again, they gave inflated ratings to these to get business. The repeal of Glass-Steagall allowed banks with deposits to take on risky investments, putting the whole system at risk. This was a debate inside the White House whether I should say this, but I've never not said what I believe. That was the worst vote I ever cast in my entire time in the United States Senate. Repeal of Glass-Steagall. There was a SEC regulation in 2004 that allowed the biggest investment banks to operate with too much leverage, too much reliance on short-term debt, and very little supervision. Across the board, there was insufficient regulatory infrastructure. A shadow banking system was allowed to operate with limited oversight. The lack of systematic regulator overseeing the whole system. New and exotic financial products, widely misunderstood, were not subject to adequate regulation. The structure of executive pay created incentives for CEOs to take excessive risks. Collectively, this wasn't about allowing banks to take on more risk. It was about shifting the risk from the banks to the government and the taxpayer. That's because the federal government lacked adequate authority to manage failures, and banks knew they had a backstop in the form of the American taxpayer. The administration and our Democratic allies in Congress knew that we had to protect American families from immediate damage, but it was imperative to identify and curb the risks that were being taken so that we could help prevent future crises. President Bush, he saw the beginnings of the crisis and knew he needed to act, even though he had no way to know of its magnitude. So he started the Troubled Assets Relief Program, so-called TARP, which injected capital into the banking system and in some cases financed purchase of toxic assets from the banks. And before stimulus was a dirty word, President Bush pushed for modest rebate checks to taxpayers to try to stem the crisis and jolt the economy a little bit. And President Obama and I, along with Republicans in the Congress, continued the TARP program to avoid a complete collapse of our financial system. Mr. Chairman, you know better anyway, voting for TARP, bailing out banks, was like putting a snake in everyone's living room. I mean, talk about the most unpopular vote any member of Congress. I really mean this now, I'm serious. The folks who, quote, caused the crisis, all of a sudden, we're making sure that we bail them out. It's hard to explain to average, well-informed Americans, but it was necessary. It was the right vote, and it helped save the economy. When all was said and done, TARP amounted to over $400 billion. But because we insisted to be paid back with interest, the taxpayers got it all back, plus $15 billion in interest. We also rescued the auto industry, which was not at all popular among Democrats or Republicans, by the way. 6 in 10 people didn't think we should do it. It was on the brink of bankruptcy. But today, and I know I got blamed for pushing that a lot, because I'm middle-class Joe and I'm the guy who's a manufacturer. You know, well, I understand, at universities in particular, Washington in very particular, to be middle class means you're not sophisticated. But I understand when the middle class does well, everybody does well. The wealthy do very well and the poor have a way up. And it's what holds together the social contract, a growing middle class. But today, the automobile industry is back on its feet. 695,000 jobs added since the automakers emerged from bankruptcy, the fastest growth on record. And Dodd-Frank was the centerpiece of our plan to stabilize the financial system and prevent another crisis. With your help, Mr. Chairman, we implemented the Volcker Rule to reinstill a firewall between risky bets and safe investments, disallowing banks from gambling with American bank deposits. The law created a Consumer Financial Protection Bureau to do everything from helping students get the best deal on their loans to making sure debt collectors act within the law to cracking down on predator lenders targeting military families. Pretty important stuff. It's now taken for granted again. But I don't know how many times my son, who was a decorated veteran of the Iraq War, he was a JAG officer, spent a year in Iraq. I remember how I had an opportunity to see him several times because I was responsible for Iraq, and I traveled in and out of Iraq a total of, in Afghanistan, 28 times. And the year he was there, I'd see him. He said, "Dad, what I most get is soldiers, panic calls coming to see me. They're foreclosing on my house at home. They're foreclosing on my house. What do I do?" Today, as a cop on the beat, CFPB has brought more than $11 billion in relief to 27 million Americans while protecting all consumers from harmful financial scams and practices. And Dodd-Frank also created the Financial Stability Oversight Council, which for the first time looked at the financial system as a whole to see where the risk might arise. The goal of the council is to monitor when a failure by a single company could end up affecting people who have nothing to do with that particular firm or company. The law regulated derivatives like credit default swaps, bringing them into exchanges to increase transparency, and brought oversight to the shadow banking system. It empowered the Fed, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, known as the FDIC, to do what it does best, empowering it to deal with bankrupt banks and permanently increase the amount of insured deposits from $100,000 to $250,000. giving people the peace of mind that their deposits are safe and preventing bank runs in the future. Required better capitalized banks, making them hold more capital to buffer against downturns and subjecting them to stress tests. Enforced conflicts of interest prohibitions with rating agencies to restore confidence that their evaluations are fair and unbiased. It put in place new regulations to change the culture of executive compensation, like say on pay, which allows shareholders to say whether executive pay raises are appropriate. Like clawbacks, the ability to claw back bonuses from underperforming executives. I'll talk about this a little bit later, but quite frankly, there's more that has to be done in reining in executive CEO pay. And this was all part of a nationwide effort to rid our financial system of the reckless behavior and fraud that nearly brought down the entire economy, not here but worldwide. But let's be honest. There were some, myself, the chairman, and several others, including the state's attorney generals, who didn't think we went far enough. I remember my son calling me, he was the Attorney General of the state of Delaware, Mr. Chairman, and saying, Dad, I can't tell you what I'm about to do because it would be a conflict of interest, but Dad, I just want to warn you, the administration is not going to like it. I'm not going to settle with these banks. Kamala Harris of California, now Senator-elect, Catherine Cortez Masto of Nevada, Senator-elect Roy Cooper of North Carolina, all elected, now elected. And I'm proud to say the Attorney General of the state of Delaware, Beau Biden, went after the banks for their role in the crisis, bringing in over $100 million back to Delaware and several billion to all three of those states. But none of this happened overnight. But the financial sector stabilized much more quickly than our critics thought it would, allowing American commerce to get back on its feet. Let's remember what our Republican friends said at the time and continue to say about Dodd-Frank. Mitch McConnell, who's a friend, and he truly is a friend, John Boehner, who's a friend, Paul Ryan, who's a friend, the entire Republican caucus. Hell, I remember when the Republicans and the conservative media thought I was exaggerating, as I said when I called it the Great Recession. The same people said Dodd-Frank would restrict credit markets. But today, credit markets are functioning again. Americans can get home, auto, student, and small business loans at reasonable rates. Congressman Hensarling, chairman of the House Financial Services, said Dodd-Frank would crush small business lending. Today, small business lending is back to pre-recession levels, and small business startups saw the largest year-over-year increase in the last 2 decades. So much for the disaster. He and so many other Republicans said it would crush community banks. Today, community banks are back lending at pre-recession levels and expanding significantly. And he and so many other Republicans said Dodd-Frank would make the banking sector riskier. But banks are better capitalized today with an additional $700 billion in capital to protect against downturns. The number of bank failures decreased from 140 in a year, the president and I took office, to 8 last year. And the cost of failures of the federal insurance fell $38 billion to under $1 billion this period, a decline of 98%. And so much for the Republican Party orthodoxy that says Dodd-Frank would be a disaster for the real economy, as my friend John Boehner said. Here are the facts. I know a lot of people, and probably many of you do, maybe even some of your parents, who lost their jobs and have been hit hard. But today, we're in the midst of the longest streak of job growth in history, over 15 million jobs added, more than all the advanced economies in the world combined. And the unemployment rate is 4.6%. Well, at the time of the Great Recession, there were too many retirees who lost their savings or delayed retirement. Today, most retirement accounts have been restored. Americans added $34 trillion in wealth over the course of this administration. While we know not everyone got back their homes, not everyone which meant everything to them, housing prices are up by about 1/3, and 8 million homeowners are above, not underwater. But what we forget is those folks who lost their home, never having missed a mortgage payment, the lawn on either side of them having turned brown because of some cockamamie loan, them ended up underwater, they lost their homes, never able to get back into a home, they're not benefiting from that additional $34 billion that's back. Or if they weren't in the market when it was down around 650, now that it's 19,000, they're not benefiting. There's a lot of people we should be paying attention to that, quite frankly, neither party paid enough attention to. And I know every time I talk about it, it's middle-class Joe again. But the truth of the matter is, a lot of people got hurt, and many are still not back. While so many workers deserve more pay for the work they do, household income is still up by 5.2% last year, $2,800 for the typical family. That's the fastest growth on record. And wages are scheduled to rise by about 3% this year alone. Our GDP is up 11%, even after accounting for inflation over the course of this administration. So there was undeniable progress over the past 8 years. And the President and I both acknowledge not enough. Not enough. That's why we proposed a number of things I'll speak to in a moment. We're a lot better off today than we were then when we took office. I don't say this as a defense of the economy. I say this as a defense of why we should not be changing in a fundamental way some of the things that are being suggested. I often say the economy has gone from crisis to recovery, and we're now on the cusp of resurgence. We also know the path to this resurgence has included real hardships for Americans, some of whom have never really made it back. They still feel left out, and they have every reason to ask why. The first truth is the American economy cannot prosper in the midst of a financial crisis, period. Our capitalist system is the greatest allocator of capital in the history of the world. But when put toward protective uses, it helps create jobs and helps build a middle class. We need it, but we also need it to function in a fair way to let everybody in. So we could have allowed the entire financial sector to go bust and drive the country into an economic depression, or we could have intervened to save the economy and laid the groundwork to rebuild the middle class. The second truth is that more should have been done. Even on top of our $1 trillion stimulus for American families, even on top of the largest tax cut for middle-class families in history, even on top of the lifeline to automakers, the President and I tried to do more. We pushed hard to pass the American Jobs Act of 2011 that provided billions for training, unemployment insurance, tax cuts for small businesses. All told, the act would have, it was estimated, added 2 million jobs and generated an additional 1.5% in economic growth. But our friends on the Hill said no. We knew that in order to prosper, we needed a 21st century infrastructure. We ranked 26th in the world, for example, in transportation infrastructure, the United States. Some of you may remember I got in a little trouble when I said if I blindfolded you and put you in LaGuardia and put you in the airport in Beijing, took your blindfold off at 2 in the morning and asked which was a developing country, you'd have said LaGuardia. Well, guess what? Everybody disagreed with me. They kept the governor, the mayor, the people of LaGuardia. Now there's a $6 billion program. This is the United States of America. We pushed for an infrastructure package that would have put millions of American workers back to work rebuilding America. But Republicans again said no. We proposed billions in tax cuts for working Americans. But again, the Hill said no. We want to make 2 years community college free. Pay for it by closing the loopholes like stepped-up basis. Republicans said no. Does anybody believe in the 21st century 12 years is enough? Does anybody really believe that to be true? That 12 years of free education is enough to compete in the 21st century? Already, that study I did for the president, 6 in 10 jobs right now require more than a college degree. Than a high school degree. We know so many other qualified women are staying out of the workforce. Why? The cost of child care. You live in Washington, you have 2 kids, it's $22,000 a year. We want to triple the maximum child care tax credit. That, along with other policies, could add 500,000 women into the workplace, increasing productivity and growth. Our friends said no. You know, when Reagan was president, we had about $800 billion in tax loopholes. Now we have $1.3 trillion per year. All the economists here at Georgetown, tell me you can justify more than 600 to 800 billion of that as generating either a social good or increased productivity. We want to reform the corporate tax code by incentivizing companies to bring their profits home and their operations back home. Our friends said no. In the end, We just didn't have the Republican votes in the Congress. So let me just say to you all that this is not your father's Republican Party. All of a sudden, I mean, I remember all the years I served in the Senate, infrastructure was pushed more by Republicans than by Democrats. Literally, not figuratively. There was a consensus on a whole range of things, like the basic bargain, that if you contributed to the well-being of the outfit you worked with, you got to share in the benefits. That was the basic bargain, Democrats and Republicans. From 1972, when I got elected as a 29-year-old kid, and 20 years before, 30 years before. Which leads to the fundamental question: where do we go from here? While the people have spoken, we can't be lulled in a sense of collective amnesia. And look, I happen to support the Electoral College, and again, I come from the state of Delaware. But 2.5 million more people spoke for the other team than the team that got elected. We can't forget, though, what caused this god-awful recession of 8 years ago. It was the same policies that are being proposed now. Halve the rate on dividends, cut the top income tax rate, dramatically reduce estate tax, deregulation orthodoxy. The president and I wanted to clear the rubble. Beyond that, we wanted to build a new stadium. We wanted to actually have lights in the stadium. But for God's sake, if we can't do that, let's at least make sure that the umpire is on the field calling balls and strikes and wearing a striped shirt. That's why we can't allow the repeal of Dodd-Frank. We can't go back to the days when the banks hired bank regulators. We can't go back to the days when the banks were free to take risks with your depositors' money. We can't go back to the days when financial companies take massive risks with the knowledge that taxpayer bailout is around the corner when they fail. We can't afford that. The country can't afford it. The middle class can't afford it. Another thing, we need to ensure that the executive compensation doesn't go back to encouraging executive risk-taking and short-termism. I've spoken at length about stock buybacks by publicly traded companies, how CEOs don't have the incentive to build for the future, but rather swing for the fences today. They're not bad guys or bad women. The process incentivized actions. That's the incentives. This all started in 1980 when President Reagan's SEC, through Rule 10b-18, made it easier for companies to buy back stock to influence their share prices. We need to change this as well, in my view. We need to complete the remaining SEC rules created by Dodd-Frank, like limits on incentive-based compensation at financial companies. As Chairman Volcker said, we also need to continue to address the threat posed by a volatile short-term debt. And as evidenced by the recent concerns of retail banks, we need to step up our monitoring of enforcement activities. Look at Wells Fargo. Look at Wells Fargo. The Justice Department, I can't speak to it because I don't talk to them. The president, I can't talk to them. We're reviewing whether or not there's criminal sanctions here. But think of what other ordinary people go to jail for. But let's be clear. This should never be allowed to happen again. Millions of families pay the price for reckless and irresponsible policies. And our regulators need to have the resources to catch this activity before it gets out of control. It's pretty basic. You don't, like me, you don't have to be an economist to understand this. You don't have to be an economist. It helps. That's why I have some brilliant economists working for me. But you don't have to be an economist to understand this. Look at what caused the problem in the first place. Look at what we did to correct the problem. And ask now if it's worthy to change back to the problems that caused this in the first place. As my little grandson would say, it's not rocket science. Ladies and gentlemen, let me close with this. My deceased wife used to tell me, and she had her expression, she said, Joey, the greatest gift God gave mankind was the ability to forget. And my mother, God love her, would immediately answer, "That's true, Joy. If that weren't true, every woman would only have one child." But it is a great gift God gave us, the ability to forget, but how could you go on? But it doesn't apply in governing, where to forget is dangerous. Dangerous. Given what the people of this country went through 8 years ago, on the cusp of a real depression, and how far we've come today on the cusp of a real potential resurgence, with the United States better positioned than any country in the world to lead the 21st century. My Lord, we are so much better positioned. I'm not supposed to be an expert in the economy, but I'm supposed to be an expert in foreign policy. An expert's anyone from out of town with a briefcase. I don't have my briefcase with me today, but I do know a lot about foreign policy. I've met every major world leader in the last 35 years. And look around the world. Do you think any leader of a major country would trade places with the President of the United States in terms of the opportunities of the 21st century? God love China. I want to see them succeed. They not only don't have enough energy, they don't have enough water. They're talking about a $2 trillion project to turn the direction of the rivers around. Raise your hand if you think the EU is our serious competition and they're going to eat our lunch, as we were told. I remember, Mr. Chairman, being up at the Wharton School debating someone from the American Enterprise Institute how Japan was going to own us. Remember they were buying the Rockefeller Center and the rest? And I was viewed as heretical by saying there's not a shot in the world that happening. Why? Not because of Barack Obama and Joe Biden. Because we have the most agile venture capitalists in the world. We have the most productive workers in the world. There are 3 times the productive workers in Asia. Energy. We're the epicenter of energy for the remainder of this century, at least the next 50 years, including renewable energy. Watch what we can do. Watch what happens. Ladies and gentlemen, we respect intellectual property. You can adjudicate contract differences and know they're going to be kept. We're so much better positioned than any nation in the world. And we have a workforce that continue to be replaced because, I might add, of the value of immigration. And name me a product that has transformed the world in terms of technology that wasn't made in America or conceived in America. The 2 great things about America, one of which is stamped in the DNA of every American, native born or otherwise. No matter how bad our education system is in grade school, no child ever gets criticized for challenging orthodoxy. Unlike any other country in the world, including our allies. We're encouraged to challenge orthodoxy. You can't make new things unless you break old things. We're a remarkable country. And we can't forget. We can't forget who we are or where we recently came from and go back to what created this crisis in the first place. We have to keep moving forward, and my hope and prayer is that we will. I think we have to give this administration, new administration, a fighting chance. I think they're in the position now of beginning to determine a lot of this stuff that seemed awful clear to them is not so clear. We'll see. We'll see what happens. If you notice, they decided they're going to immediately repeal the Affordable Care Act. Then all of a sudden they figured out 20 million people will be off, no one have insurance. Then all of a sudden they figured out, holy mackerel, all those kids on your insurance policy, all you guys are on your parents' insurance policy. Good night. Good night, Lucy. All of a sudden, they found out that they can go back to charging women more for insurance than men. All of a sudden they figured out, my Lord, pre-existing conditions, I guess, do matter. Now what are they talking about? We repeal immediately and will go in effect after the next election. Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. Folks, look. Because there's so many young people in this audience, I want you to know two things. America has developed some incredible women and men who never ever stop fighting for what they think is right for the country, like Paul Volcker. You've been a treasure, Mr. Chairman, I really mean it. No, you have been. There are voices that should be listened to based on their batting average. Take a look at what they said and what happened. Judge objectively whether or not it's worth listening to them. Measured against how fundamental things have changed and whether it's still relevant, whether it's still timely. But folks, this is no time to turn back. I got elected when I was a 29-year-old kid to the United States Senate. I was listed as the young idealist. I've been doing nothing but getting up every morning, as my dad would say. It's a lucky person who puts 2 feet in the floor in the morning when they get up, knows what they're about to do, and thinks it still matters. I think it still matters a lot, a whole lot. And folks, just take a look. Take a look at where we are positioned to everyone else in the world. I was listed as the young optimist when I got elected. I'll conclude by saying I can say without fear of contradiction to anybody who knows me, I am truly more optimistic about America's chances today than any time I have been since I've served, and I've served for 44 years as either United States Senator or as Vice President. We just got to get some people out of the way. Thank you all very, very much.